Let's take a look at some principles of interpersonal communication. So the way we're going to do this, we're just going to define interpersonal communication. We're going to look at the way that communication isn't always intended, the idea of content and relationship, intentional versus unintentional. Communication can be irreversible, dynamic, how it relates to needs, and how it relates to goals. So the first thing we want to look at is the interpersonal communication is dyadic. So we mentioned before that dyads mean two. So most of the time our interpersonal communication is happening between you and another person. Again, this could expand itself out to multiple people, but for the most part, it happens between just two people. So that's just a basic idea that happens with interpersonal communication. Intrapersonal communication could be communication with yourself. So I talk about this when I always say, well, if you're having a conversation with yourself, it's okay as long as you're not answering back in a voice you don't understand or have never heard before, because that's scary. But if, I think a lot of times we talk to ourselves, whether it's an out loud conversation in your car, or it might be just the conversation that's going on in your head. I joke around about it being like Radio San Juan, that constant conversation that is like running in the back of your mind about lists of things that you have to get taken care of, or some other thing that maybe not have you be completely present in that moment. But we have sometimes conversations with ourselves. And there is an element sometimes of conversations being impersonal. So that could be exchanges that don't necessarily have a lot of impact on you, or maybe you might be sitting next to your a friend or family member, and you might be commenting on something that's based on the television, and it's not really that you're having a direct conversation with that person, but maybe you're just in the room with each other. It's not really personal, it's more impersonal. So those are just some elements to take a look at when it comes to interpersonal communication. Another principle to look at is this idea of content versus relational. Content looks at more actual meaning, and relationship looks at more of how it's viewed based on the context of the relationship. So how that communication's happening. There's a lot of elements that happen here that are nonverbal. So how the person might present themselves to you, maybe they act as though they're superior. I think about like kids with each other, how they're relating to each other, and how that might be happening in that moment, about how you're communicating on both of those levels. So you have a lot that happens with verbal communication, but the nonverbal communication has a tendency to be actually more profound. So we find that we're being very influenced by the way that someone's communicating with us with their eye contact, or the tone of their voice. I call it being snarky when I hear sometimes teenagers, when they kind of get that sound in their voice, they're being a little snarky. And then meta communication is communication about the communication. So maybe when you're sitting there with a friend of yours and somebody walks up and says, hey, and they have a conversation with you, and then you look at your friend afterwards, you say, well, what did that mean? So you're trying to understand what the communication means. So you might be having communication about the communication. So that's the idea of content versus relationship. Communication can be intentional and non-intentional. So there's oftentimes meaning that we intend, and so we're communicating with something and we're trying to make sure the other person's understanding what we mean. And then there's sometimes communication that happens and it's not intentional. So I know for me, sometimes I'll roll my eyes and somebody says something to me, I'm like, well, that's kind of dumb. And I'll roll my eyes, and I don't really mean to do that. I've just done it on an unconscious level. So sometimes that little piece of nonverbal communication can say a lot to somebody, like she's rolling her eyes, so she doesn't believe what I have to say, or she's not taking me serious. So that I think a lot of times the unintentional portion of communication happens on the nonverbal side. And communication's irreversible. So once it's out there, you can't delete it. I know that there's been situations when I said something and I wish I could put it back. I could rewind it and put it back in my mouth and never have said it, because it will come out before you have an opportunity to think about it. So see if you can take a second or two and maybe think about what you're going to say before it goes out of your mouth, because we don't really have the opportunity to rewind it. I think I've gotten used to having my DVR on my TV and being able to rewind something. Man, I sure wish that there were times in my life when I wish I could have just taken it back. And it's dynamic. So when we look at interactions, there aren't two interactions that are going to be the same. There's always things that are going to be shifting and changing. Moments are different, situations are different, contexts are different. So communication's happening in a different environment. So, and you've learned again from the last time you did this communication. So if you are in a relationship with somebody and you have a spouse, and maybe you have a certain communication that's happened with that person, and now you're having kind of a repeat of that conversation, you've learned from the last time you spoke with them. You have more information. So even though there's an element of repeating the same idea, that communication is going to happen slightly different just because you've learned in the process of that communication. Maslow is probably going to be someone, if you haven't run into Maslow before, you probably will run into Maslow again. So, but Maslow, I think, is an interesting idea to discuss because he gives us a model in which to communicate concepts or ideas, or kind of where people are sitting. And I oftentimes spend a little chunk of time talking about Maslow because it does give us a model in order to look at human needs and where kind of people are in that process. So let's take a look at this model and this idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And let's just start off with this idea of physiological. So the first thing you want to think about is a person needs to take care of the basic stuff. You'll notice that's on there is breathing, food, water, sex, sleep, being able to eliminate, and homeostasis. So homeostasis just means having some level of balance. If you don't have food, if you're really, really tired, it's really hard to focus on anything else. You kind of need to take care of breathing right away if you're not breathing. So there are some elements that have to be taken care of before you can pay attention to anything else. If I don't have those basic physiological needs taken care of, sorry, nothing else is going to matter. So if I have those physiological needs taken care of, then the next thing that I'm going to be able to focus on is security, employment, just being able to take care of family, health, prosperity. So once I've got that basic stuff taken care of, and your home and shelter and stuff falls down there under the physiological needs. So once I have that taken care of, I can start paying attention to the next level. So how is my family doing? Do I have security? The next piece that's going to come into play is friendships and loving and belonging and self and those elements, and feeling like I have connection with other people. The next piece might happen is, if I've got those other three things taken care of that are below, is self-esteem. So how do I feel about myself? I think of things that might fall in here would be things like, am I doing work that makes me feel satisfied? Do I feel like I have respect of other people, or am I respecting other people myself? How confident do I feel? Do I feel like I've achieved something, like I'm doing something good? And the very top portion up there, which is self-actualization, looks at morality, spontaneity, how, am I solving problems? I think about self-actualization kind of being if if I'm at my best. If I'm at my best, I'm able to kind of achieve more. So I'm kind of functioning at my highest level. I don't think that people like reach self-actualization and then they can go live on a mountaintop and be self-actualized. That isn't quite the way that it works. We don't go, yes, I've achieved self-actualization. No, because then I get hungry and I'm back down there at the bottom again. So you don't necessarily achieve self-actualization like it's a place that you stay. You're going to move up and down on here at any given moment based on what your circumstances are or your situation. So when I think about this too, if you look at commercials, commercials are going to be functioning at different levels as well. So you might find a commercial that's focusing on your basic needs. They're like, hey, you don't have food or water. What was happening for you? And then you see other ones that are going to be kind of focusing on a little higher one. Do you want to have friends hang out with you? Well, you're going to probably be hanging out with the love and belonging area. I think about, like, there's a dandruff commercial out there, and if you don't use our specific dandruff shampoo, then all of the girls you might be interested in are going to turn to flakes. So it's kind of interesting seeing where those are. And then like car commercials sometimes will be up there in the self-actualized part. If you're living at your best self, you're being your best self, you're being self-actualized. And so you'll see commercials that are operating at different levels. If you don't have a lot of money, you're probably, they're suggesting that you don't have maybe some of those safety needs taken care of. If you don't have money, then you might be stuck down there in safety. But if you have plenty of money, maybe you could be up there in the self-actualized part. So just notice, what's happening with that. And sometimes when we're communicating, we might be communicating in a different level depending on where I'm at and where the person I'm talking to is at. So Ken, we talked about encoding a message. If I know that the person that I'm talking to is hanging out there, down there towards the bottom in the safety and physiological needs, am I going to be talking to them about being self-actualized and what that looks like? No. If I want to encode my message at the most basic level, I'm going to make sure I'm focusing on the basic needs of the person I'm talking to. So notice communication and where communication happens. I think just advertising is just a great place to see this because it happens at different levels and you're able to kind of experience it there. The last one that we're going to look at is this idea of goals. And a lot of times our goals are going to be out there and we're going to look at specific goals. So I might look at self-presentation goals, and it may be the way that I want to be perceived by other people. So how am I going to present myself the best way? So I might look at the way that I'm dressed. I might look at my vocabulary and how am I using words that day. So I'm going to pay attention to my verbal and nonverbal communication when it comes to self-presentation, because I want to make sure that I'm presenting myself in the best way I can. Instrumental goals are more about practicality and kind of accomplishing those types of goals through my encounters with other people. So how might I get practical goals achieved? And in the last one, which is relationship goals, I'm looking at how I might be using communication to build a relationship, or how I might use it to maintain it, or how I might use it to terminate it. I've unfortunately been in situations where I've had to fire people. And that's a tough conversation. I think the first time I did it, I cried. And I remember my boss like telling me to go maybe be off by myself for a little while I was kind of coping with it. And it wasn't necessarily that I, was upset about the person that I was firing. I was upset about the power that I had in that context. So figuring out the words and the best way to say something can be an interesting challenge. So if I'm trying to build a relationship with someone, I'm going to use different languaging. I'm going to relate to them differently. I'm going to use different nonverbal communication in order to make sure that I'm communicating with them in the best way that I can. So these were just some of the concepts that we were looking at in terms of the principles of communication.